media conference via internet. In the name of Medela, I welcome all of you to the 12th International Breastfeeding and Lactation Symposium, which takes place this year in beautiful Florence. Thank you for joining us. We wish you great experiences, good insights with our 9 speakers. 7 of them are here today in our media conference this morning. So I hand over to my colleague, Olivia Coker-Decker, who is leading through this conference. Our speakers will introduce their topic to you so that you feel what we're gonna speak about, what the topics are, why we are investing quite some time and energy into this topic. And then we ask you to ask questions, as many as you want to hear of, so that this topic can become more and more popular. So thank you, Olivia.
Thank you, Martin. Welcome. As Martin said, we're here in Florence, which is a great pleasure. We know that Florence is home to some of the most beautiful art and architecture in the world. A lesser-known fact is that it's also home to ancient breastfeeding debates that have been recorded in a book by a Renaissance man, Leon Battista Alberti. The debate at that time was about whether a mother, an aristocratic mother, should breastfeed her own baby, or whether she should have a wet nurse breastfeed the baby, a servant. Why was this a debate? Because it was thought that nobility didn't just run in the blood, it probably ran in the breast milk as well. And so the baby breastfed by its own mother would be smarter, would have a better character, and could possibly be better looking. Now we're here 600 years later, and we still have a breastfeeding debate. It's a little bit more scientific now, but some of the questions are the same. Does it matter if a mother gives her own milk or if the baby gets the milk of another mother? Does it matter if the milk comes from another animal, like a cow or a goat? Does it matter if the milk comes from powder? We know that it does matter because human milk is rich. It's infinitely more complex than human blood. So far, we've identified, or scientists, not me, have identified over 400 proteins, over 200 oligosaccharides, hormones, stem cells, hundreds of thousands of bioactive molecules in human milk. And that breastfeeding debate, 600 years ago, got some things right. Human milk does improve cognitive development for babies. It also boosts the immune system. It can have lifelong health benefits, and it actually can make you better looking, but for different reasons. So we gather everyone together each year. We gather these brilliant minds at the vanguard of human milk and lactation research so that they can pass on their profound research and practical methods for improving breastfeeding rates. Also, so that they can exchange ideas. And I watched this happen last night at dinner. They're exchanging ideas, they're feeding off of each other, and we're looking at the next wave of research and pushing forward the frontier of this science. I've just scratched the surface with the things that I've said. Get ready, because there will be some stunning revelations today. So now, let me introduce this panel, starting with Professor Bo Lönnerdal. He leads the program in pediatric nutrition at the University of California in Davis. He is a multiple award winner. He has served on the advisory panel for the World Health Organization and is a member of the International Society for Research on Human Milk and Lactation, to name just a few credentials. We can't go through the whole list because they're long. Catharina Svanborg is professor of clinical immunology at Lund University in Sweden. She's a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Science. She has over 400 publications under her belt, and she was named Scientist of the Year. Katie Hinde, her TED Talk went up 1 week ago, and since then, she's have over 427,000 views. This is a TED Talk on human milk. That is getting the word out. Her March Mammal Madness educational campaign has over 200,000 student subscribers, right? She is associate professor at the Center for Evolution and Medicine at the Arizona State University, and she directs the Comparative Lactation Laboratory at the California National Primate Research Center. Dr. Riccardo Davanzo is director of pediatrics and neonatology at the Madonna delle Grazie Hospital. He chairs the Task Force on Breastfeeding at the Italian Ministry of Health, and he's collaborated on several projects with the World Health Organization and with UNICEF. Professor Guido Moro. Your credentials go on. We have a short summary. All right, he was professor of neonatology at the University of Milan and the Maternity Hospital of Milan. He was the very first president of the European Milk Bank Association. And for his science and his social work, he was awarded the Gold Medal, which is the highest honor by the city of Milan. Diane Spatz. Diane Spatz is professor of perinatal nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. She directs the lactation program at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Her testimony helped to shape the United States Surgeon General's call to action to support breastfeeding. And last year, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Association of Neonatal Nurses in the USA. And definitely, not least, last this time, but Donna Geddes. She's associate professor in the School of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the University of Western Australia. She is senior research fellow of one of the most prestigious lactation and human milk programs in the world, founded by Professor Peter Hartman. She exploded a model that was 160 years old of the lactating breast through her ultrasound research to show us the true internal anatomy of a lactating breast. So, that's your panel, experts. And now, let me ask you to give your summaries of your presentations. I'll start with you, Professor Lönnerdal.
I will talk about bioactive proteins in breast milk. As Olivia told you, there are profound differences between breastfed infants and formula-fed infants even to this day. And I believe that many of these differences are due to bioactive proteins. With bioactive proteins means that they're not only a source of amino acids, which infants need to grow, of course, but they are providing physiological activities beyond that in the gastrointestinal tract. And I will talk about the way we are exploring this in the laboratory by using cells and animal models, but I will also talk about clinical trials that I've been doing in Sweden, in China, and in Peru, where we try to provide evidence why we believe that these components are so important for the breastfed infants.
Wonderful, thank you. Professor Svanborg, can I just give a little introduction, because it's mind-blowing research, this. She started looking for antibacterial properties in milk. And then suddenly, the milk was killing cancer, right? And then you found this complex that you named Hamlet, after a Danish prince, not that far from you. And now you're about to develop a based on this complex. So, please tell us about that.
Buongiorno. Come ha detto Olivia, è una cosa affascinante vivere e lavorare con una molecola di scoperta che nessuno pensava ci fosse, nessuno pensava esistesse. È un po' come una favola per bambini. Per cui incominciamo dicendo c'era una volta, come diceva Olivia, cercavamo dei nuovi antibiotici, avevamo delle cellule tumorali nel tubo e le cellule tumorali sono morte. E da allora abbiamo intrapreso 3 strade. Abbiamo cercato di capire cos'è la molecola, si chiama Hamlet e nel pomeriggio vi parlerò di cosa è Hamlet e che parte di Hamlet è attivo. E la seconda domanda è com'è che ammazza le cellule tumorali e abbiamo molto lavoro dietro di noi. Siamo convinti che stiamo guardando un nuovo modello della morte tumorale delle cellule e la cosa eccitante è che ha specificità, non c'è nulla che è tumorale rispetto a sano. Questo non esiste in biologia, ma questa molecola ha una specificità molto forte per le cellule tumorali. E l'ultimo punto è sulla terapia. Noi abbiamo preso molto tempo e stiamo molto attenti a guardare parecchi dei modelli animali e stiamo facendo 2 trial clinici, per cui io credo che possiamo dire sicuramente che Hamlet si può usare terapeuticamente e forse si può usare in modo preventivo, che è una cosa molto interessante. Per cui per quelli che saranno qui oggi pomeriggio spero che ci sarà molta discussione, molto dibattito su tutto questo. Grazie. Katie Hine. La lattazione comparativa, questo non è un termine, cioè noi sappiamo della letteratura comparativa, della storia comparativa, ma cosa impariamo dalla lattazione comparativa? Grazie e grazie di avermi invitato qui quest'oggi. Io sono affascinata dal latte materno perché questo è un adattamento nei mammiferi che è stato formato da 300 anni di selezione naturale e evoluzione. E capire il modo in cui ogni specie sintetizza il latte specificatamente fatto apposta per la sua situazione particolare, per i suoi giovani, è una delle grandi domande alle quali non si è riuscito a trovare risposta nella scienza e nella biologia della lattazione, per cui quali animali vivono, dove vivono, cosa mangiano, la velocità con la quale si sviluppano i neonati, le sfide che si trovano gli infanti ad affrontare, cosa possono fare per diventare adulti. Tutte queste sfide sono in generale organizzate e messe insieme all'inizio della vita attraverso il latte materno. Nella mia ricerca io cerco il latte attraverso parecchie specie per capire particolarmente le proprietà eccezionali, forse uniche, del latte umano che non si trovano da nessun'altra parte nel regno mammifero. Grazie. Dottor Davanzo, noi sappiamo che il contenuto pelle a pelle, skin to skin, fra la madre e il bambino è molto importante, ma può anche essere rischioso nelle prime 2 ore della vita. Ci può dire qualcosa su questo nuovo protocollo per facilitare questo contatto skin to skin, pelle a pelle, che sia sicuro?
Noi dobbiamo valutare il fatto che esistono ostacoli e altri invece fattori che facilitano il fatto di promuovere l'allattamento materno negli ambienti ospedalieri. Naturalmente, se noi riusciamo a eliminare gli ostacoli e introduciamo 2 fattori che possono facilitarlo, questo dipende dalla conoscenza e di quelli sono gli atteggiamenti degli infermieri, coloro che lavorano in questo settore. Questo è un fatto che dobbiamo assolutamente valutare e sapere. E la ragione fondamentale per cui si oppongono degli ostacoli è la sicurezza, prima di tutto. Naturalmente deve esistere un modo sicuro per realizzare una vera cura del bambino, del neonato, ma noi sappiamo che il pelle a pelle, skin to skin, è veramente uno dei comportamenti principali dal quale ha inizio l'allattamento materno. Ma dobbiamo anche sapere, essere consapevoli del fatto che esiste un certo rischio se questo non viene realizzato e gestito in modo sicuro. Per questo abbiamo deciso nell'ospedale pediatrico di Trieste di redigere un protocollo perché tutti potessero sentirsi a loro agio ed essere certi che venivano fatte le cose giuste, e presenterò questo protocollo. Benissimo. Professor Moro, lei è uno specialista del latte latte che viene dai donatori e molto spesso ci si basa su questo o mentre aspettiamo che la madre riesca a far montare il latte, ma non sappiamo anche questo, cioè, che c'è una sfida che rappresenta quella conservazione del latte, gli aspetti nutritivi, la qualità del latte. Bene, cosa si deve fare per poter conservare questa qualità? Bene, noi sappiamo che tutte le banche di latte umano che esistono al mondo oggi utilizzano la metodologia Holder per poter lavorare questo latte umano, e questa tecnologia che lavora ad una temperatura di 62,5 gradi, e questo processo però può distruggere i batteri e i virus, ma è deleterio per alcune componenti del latte umano. Per esempio distrugge alcune componenti immunologiche come l'IgA esecutivo, l'isozimi, eccetera. E proprio per questo e per poter migliorare la qualità del latte che viene preparato nelle banche di latte umano, ci sono vari gruppi che hanno valutato in nuove metodologie, e qui in Italia abbiamo cominciato un paio d'anni fa con un progetto che si chiama il latte basso, cioè una piccola quantità di latte che viene lavorato a una temperatura di 72 gradi per 50 secondi, perciò per un periodo più breve di tempo, e vi spiegherò i vantaggi di queste metodologie in confronto ad altri metodi che venivano utilizzati finora. Professor Spatz, meno del 40% allattano i bambini al seno, è giusto? Ebbene, il suo modello non è quello di aiutare, di formare, ma di cambiare la cultura che esiste a proposito dell'allattamento al seno. Bene, grazie, è un grande piacere per me essere qui oggi. Lavoro in questo settore da più di 20 anni nel settore dell'allattamento al seno, e durante questo periodo in cui ho lavorato a questo, ebbene, abbiamo visto che non è che le cose sono migliorate molto su scala mondiale, a parte il poter fare un allattamento al seno solamente per un breve periodo. E noi pochissimi posti su scala mondiale che sostengono questo tipo di allattamento, e quando parlerò domani cercherò di specificare due modelli che abbiamo sviluppato per poter sostenere questo allattamento al seno globalmente. Prima di tutto il ruolo del critico delle infermiere, delle ostetriche, perché che comprendono sono quella professione paramedica che esiste in tutto il mondo. Se noi aiutiamo le infermiere a educarle, a dare le prove scientifiche che riguardano proprio l'allattamento al seno, non riusciremo a far sì che le persone possano raggiungere questo loro obiettivo di poter allattare al seno. E perciò noi abbiamo lavorato nella maternità a Filadelfia, abbiamo poi riprodotto questi modelli anche nel resto del mondo, compreso l'India, la Cina, eccetera, per poter educare le infermiere che sono i punti di riferimento per il supporto e la cura dell'allattamento al seno. E noi ci concentriamo soprattutto le donne e la loro separazione bambino. Abbiamo dimostrato che se prendiamo una donna e tutta la sua famiglia, li facciamo seguire questo modello che abbiamo preparato, possono in effetti continuare a fare quello che gli è stato insegnato in ospedale anche al di là dell'uscita dall'ospedale, e per cui molto spesso corrispondono in pieno e soddisfano in pieno tutte le caratteristiche dell'allattamento al seno, e continuano a allattare al seno i bambini per molto tempo. Ebbene, per cui dobbiamo educare le infermiere, e abbiamo questo modello ben applicato non solo negli Stati Uniti ma anche in altri paesi al mondo. E vorrei
which basically is a train-the-trainer model. And we found that by doing this regional assembly, we were able to have hospitals adapt best practices at rates of over 50% in less than a 10-year period of time, which is astounding when you look at what the research says about how long it takes to translate research into clinical practice. The average is reported to be about 17 years. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. So, Professor Geddes, one of your specialties, I should say, is the suck, swallow, breathe mechanism, right? And you have some recent case studies done on preterm infants, which are helping you to develop interventions so that you can get them to the breast earlier and get them breastfeeding longer. Is that right?
That's right. So clearly the ultimate goal for breastfeeding, or for a preterm infant, is to fully breastfeed, to gain all the benefits and the advantages associated with not only the human milk, but the contact with the mother and the actual mechanics of breastfeeding. Now, Olivia mentioned that maybe breastfeeding infants are more handsome, more gorgeous. Now, the science does support that, because the actual mechanics of breastfeeding are different to bottle feeding or other types of feeding. Our bone structure and our maxillary nasal complexes are all developed by the stresses that are applied to our facial bones, and the very act of breastfeeding remodels all of that. So that has astounding impacts on things like breathing, ADHD and things like that. So we have this massive background of literature that suggests that the act of breastfeeding is incredibly important. My specialty is that I love to bring perhaps art and science together. So through 14 shades of grey, because you can't see 50 shades of grey in an ultrasound image, it's not possible, we look at how the tongue moves in relation to how the baby sucks, and we gain incredible amounts of information about that. And we can see the way they're sucking, and does that relate to how successful they are to remove milk from the breast. Now, that's a very basic study, but what that has done is led us to analyse that data and go, how do we improve things? Now we know this, can we change what's happening in the breast so that the baby gets more milk? Can we keep the baby at the breast, get more milk to the baby so that the top-ups become less and less? And then, as Diane pointed out, longevity of breastfeeding is not very good at the moment. So how do we empower women and improve the breastfeeding in hospital for preterm infants so that when they go home they sustain that breastfeeding for much longer? Because we all know that the more you get, the better looking you are. Well, the healthier you are. So I'm going to show a lot of shades of grey in my talk, because we're getting to the end of the conference, and you'll be able to see for yourselves what the research is showing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you. So many different facets of this science. So now we invite you in the audience to ask your questions. Dive into these topics. Don't be afraid. It's not stupid. There's no way to know this in advance. So please. And also, you online, please ask your questions. We're ready. Yes. Maria, do you want to take the microphone? Okay, thank you. It's right here. Yes.
Good morning. I've been lucky and I think a bit tenacious because I have breastfed my both daughters more than 2 years, both. But I have many friends that have tried a lot to breastfeed their sons and daughters, but they couldn't. They tried, and I would like to know if there is some reason why some babies can't do it. Is it possible that they can't? I have had this experience with my friends.
Who would like to answer? Did you want to ask anybody in particular, or should we say Professor Spatz, Professor Geddes? Okay.
So I can just speak from perhaps the more scientific evidence base. There are often cases that we see mothers where it is the infant that is the issue. So many times the mothers think it's them, that they're not doing something right. So particular infant things that we've seen are some babies don't create enough vacuum and not able to suck very hard, and that's associated with things like prematurity, laryngomalacia, which is this noisy breathing, low tone, and the biggest concern is when I see a baby that does that and I don't know why. So this is why we need much more research in this area in order to help those mothers. And of course, dare I say it, tongue tie is a controversial area. However, the evidence or the research we've done in that area have just been on snipping the very obvious anterior tongue ties. And one more thing that we do in all of our studies is that we measure the amount of milk that the baby takes by test weighing. So when a mother comes into our study, we will know if her baby's not getting enough milk. We will know if she has low supply. We will know if she's right about what she feels about her supply. So there are certainly incidents where mothers struggle that perhaps measurement would be helpful for them.
So I will hear stories every day about mothers who tried to breastfeed and couldn't. And when I hear the stories, it's almost always because they did not receive appropriate evidence-based support and care immediately after delivery and during the first week. We have very sound research data that shows what happens in the first hour after birth is critical for milk supply. What happens in the first 4 days is critical for milk supply. What happens in the first week is critical for milk supply. But if mothers aren't getting appropriate evidence-based support and care at that critical window of opportunity, they're going to get into a situation where they're going to come into Donna Center and be evaluated about why breastfeeding is not going well or why it's not working. And there are very few situations when a mom actually cannot produce enough milk. Maybe if she's had breast reduction surgery or if she has abnormal breast tissue development, but that's about less than 2% of the population. So many of times when we see these women who have tried breastfeeding and were not able, it's because they really haven't gotten the appropriate evidence-based support and care. And I just recently published an article about this topic of, I really believe we need to change how we promote breastfeeding. We can't just keep telling women, breastfeeding is great, it's good, you must do it, it's so fabulous. We need to actually set the women up with realistic expectations. Let them know that they might have challenges, but that we as health professionals are going to help them work through those challenges, and as Donna said, identify what the actual issue is so that they can go on to continue to breastfeed. Because too many times I see that women have attempted breastfeeding, then they don't go on, but it's because they haven't really gotten the appropriate evidence-based assessment, support, and care.
Thank you, Professor Spatz. I think that's really important because I've heard that there are statistics in some countries where something like 50% of women think that they cannot actually breastfeed, that they cannot produce enough milk. And what you're saying is that less than 2% of women maybe will struggle to produce enough milk, but the rest of the women could be supported through that. It's very important. Is there another question? Wonderful.
I had a question for Associate Professor Katie Hinde. I was wondering, what are the most striking differences between primate compared to human milk, and what makes human milk unique?
That's a great question about what are the exceptional properties of human milk. I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, and anthropologists had spent decades speculating that there would be incredibly unique aspects of human milk that underlie the amazing brain growth of the human neonate, right? So humans have very large brains relative to any of the other living primates, and there was speculation that we'd see differences in glucose in terms of fueling that brain, or fatty acids in terms of building that brain. And in 2011, along with a colleague, Lauren Milligan, and we'd finally accumulated enough data on the macro categories of milk. Right? So there's over 200 species of primate. We've only described the gross composition of milk for less than 40 of them. Okay, so we have deficits in our knowledge, but we were able to do a very sophisticated analysis that looked at evolutionary history and diet and brains. And what we found is that in terms of the amount of fat, the amount of protein, and the amount of carbohydrates or sugar, lactose, that human milk looks like primate milk. We look like our primate heritage. When we dig deeper into breast milk, we start to see in these micro bioactives some of the big differences. So the things that I'll be talking about are following up on Bo's work on the proteins. So they're, unlike the speculations that it was going to be in the lactose or it was going to be in the fat, what we actually find is that proteins that localize to brain regions seem to be significantly elevated in human milk relative to rhesus monkey milk. Those are the only species for which we have that data to actually do the comparison. So the jury's still out when it comes to ape milk. We find that the glycans in primate milk, so these are the oligosaccharides that the baby largely isn't digesting. Some of them they are, but most of them pass intact into the lower intestinal tract, and they really work as ecological organizers of the microbes that are colonizing the infant's gut. And these microbes are really, really important for how we digest our food and make nutrients bioavailable. They're really, really important for our immune function, and they also release dopamine and serotonin and other kind of neurotransmitters that affect mood. Right? So when babies are having a tantrum, that may be them, and some of it may be these bitty buddies inside their gut. What we find is that relative to any of the studied primates, humans we make many, many, many more of these glycans. They represent, like just in terms of the types, they are a much larger proportion of the milk total. And the glycans that we make are much more complicated. They're very elaborated. And this is a big area of inquiry because even though, depending on what glycobiologist you talk to, there's somewhere between 200 and 1,000 different glycans, right? Any individual mother is going to be only making a subset. And so us and many other teams are trying to understand what determines this variation from mother to mother. Right now, it looks like it has a lot to do, not surprisingly, with nutrition and disease ecology. Now, the microbes are there interfacing with our food and our pathogens. So it seems as though we feed microbes as a function of what are we eating and what pathogens are we encountering. We also find that the ability of milk to kill viruses seems to be highly tailored to the viruses a particular species encounters. So human breast milk seems to be better at killing human viruses than the generalized primate antiviral factors within breast milk.
Wow. Did you have a follow-up to that, Professor Svanborg?
Yes, there are lots of things to discuss, obviously, but since the topic for me is Hamlet today, that's a molecular complex that's made by components in human milk, but you can't make it directly from bovine milk or milk from other species, including kangaroos that we have tested. So there are, I think once you look at a specific function and its molecular definers, you know, either microbes or cancer cells or whatever, then you can resolve also some important differences that favor human milk, of course.
Yes, please.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah.
I want to follow up to your point. And have you looked at elephant milk? Because elephants don't get cancer.
No, if anyone has access to elephant milk, we would absolutely look at it immediately.
Actually, I know someone that's got elephant milk in Melbourne. If they still have samples, we can get some.
Fantastic.
We grew the stem cells in it, so they have stem cells in their milk.
This is what I was talking about. This is what I was talking about. Okay, do we have another question?
Yes, there are some questions in Italian, so please your headphone on for translation, if you prefer.
Good morning. I'm sorry, but my English isn't good enough, and I'd like to. I am a blogger. I deal with equality, and I was asking myself if breastfeeding were only something that can be done only in women, or if the man can have a role, and a fundamental role in breastfeeding as well, for gender equality purposes, because I don't think we can close everything only thinking about women alone or men alone, and this is something I talk about in my articles. So can men do something, help women in breastfeeding, and are there consequences of this active partnership with the woman who is breastfeeding? That's my question. Thank you.
Maria will translate that into English for us briefly. Oh, it's already, so everybody understood that. Okay, good, thank you.
I could give a quick comment before. I think some others in the panel may have more extensive studies. But in terms of genetics, you can relate to what Katie said in her previous comment, because the glycan composition is determined by genes from the father and the mother, obviously. So there will be a certain contribution. The glycans are what microbes recognize to infect host cells, to populate the intestine, as we just heard. And so the recognition there makes every baby unique. And it means that the microbes that decide to stay in your gut or affect your brain or urinary tract or whatever, these microbes are special for the baby. And so the father has definitely an influence at the level of what's expressed in the child. I'm not aware of father's genes being important for milk, but maybe somebody else has that.
Okay, I can add only another thing, that it is very important, the role of the father, because it's the role of the whole family that is important, and mainly the role of the father, because if the father is not supporting the mother, the lactation will fail, surely. So if you are supporting your wife or your girlfriend, you can be sure that she will be able to go on and to be successful. But if you are against breastfeeding and you are telling to your wife, don't take care of your baby, there are artificial formula, you will ruin your breast, it can be interfere with the sexual activity, okay, you will lose, the mother will lose the milk.
I'd like to just give a follow-up to that, because at my institution, all of our babies are critically ill. They are admitted to the neonatal intensive care unit immediately. And the mother has a sick baby, and we actually give the father a 10-step job list. And we tell the father, the mom's only job the first week after delivery is to eat, sleep, pump, and visit the baby. And we actually tell the dad, you have to do everything else. So the dad is in charge of putting the pump together. The dad actually pumps the mom in the operating room. If she's had a C-section and her baby's sick, the dad is the one who's expressing the mother in the operating room. He's responsible for everything for that family. And if it's a healthy baby, we tell the mom her only job is to eat, sleep, and breastfeed her baby. And then the father, again, is responsible for caring for that mother, so that's her most important job. And so his role is critical in terms of her support. And the research from the U.S. shows us that if the father's not on board with this, no matter how much the mom wants to do it, she's not going to be able to. So father has a critical role.
So the role of the father has evolved a lot then over the years.
Yeah, I'd actually like to follow up on
okay.
that very point, in that, you know, there's a lot of work from anthropologists now understanding the biology of fatherhood. And there are many ways, in addition to directly supporting the mom, that fathers can help provide care to the mom and the baby. But there's also opportunities for pumping and feeding breast milk to the baby by the father. There's support for safe co-sleeping as well as breastfeeding. And there's many ways in which fathers can directly care for the baby and help enhance their bond and the bond of the family.
Interesting.
And I think if we look at Lee Gettler's work, he talks in terms of not the dyad, but the triad. So we were never just the mother and the baby. It was always the father, the mother, and the baby. And he actually documented changes in the hormones of the father when he was around his breastfeeding wife and baby. And so physiologically, those changes will relate to protection and naturally entice the father, I believe, into the inner circle, if you like. But I think that's really interesting that breastfeeding changes you as a father.
Wow. Next question. Do we have another question?
We have another question in Italian as well.
Good morning. I'm rather embarrassed since I have to choose just one question because all your research seems extraordinary. Congratulations. As a journalist, I was very impressed by the research work which Professor Svanborg will be presenting. So I have a question which is very direct, and obviously she's going to be presenting to us an extremely interesting scenario that opens hope for many, many people who are ill with cancer, and this pathology has become more and more concerning in our world. So the question is, can you give us an idea of how much time will be necessary from experimentation to pass to a drug that can be available for all patients? And then I have another question, perhaps for Professor Davanzo, as president of the technical table of the government on breastfeeding. I have a question which is rather more general. In your opinion, how is Italian culture, what is its, are we at a good level as to breastfeeding? Is there much to do in terms of breastfeeding, and in what direction?
Thank you very much for your question. I mean, in addition to breast milk being so important for the baby, we are now seeing an example where we can identify a molecule in breast milk and take it, in a sense, out of context and produce it as a drug. And that's what we are trying to do as quickly as possible. You would think that because the origin of this molecule is in human milk, we would not have to do all these things that you normally do for drug development. But that is not true. We have to do everything by the book. So there are scenarios for what's called GMP production, which is production in a factory with spacesuits and sterility and so on. those criteria have to be met. There are criteria for toxicology, even though you think we have tried this molecule in a number of models, we haven't seen toxicity, but still, formally, you have to fulfill all of these criteria, and you have to surround yourself, in addition to the science, with experts who are absolutely top in terms of integrity and expertise in these areas. And so 1.5 years ago, approximately, we finally received about 5 million euros in funding to do this work. And this is why we are now in this phase of trying to get Hamlet as a drug to patients. I can give you just a few snapshots. So one thing is, what is the drug? And from dealing with the whole Hamlet molecule, we have now been able to find a fragment that we can make synthetically and add the lipid. You know, it's always a protein and a lipid. But this synthetic fragment can be made in kilogram quantities. So it puts us in a new situation in terms of clinical trials, and also in terms of planning, hopefully, with different collaborators, which indications one can add. So we have decided to focus on bladder cancer, because we have performed a clinical study, not a trial, but a clinical study in bladder cancer in humans that was very promising in terms of a response. It was not a placebo-controlled trial, so we cannot say that it works as a drug. But this is why our Swedish FDA suggested that we should focus on bladder cancer. And we have identified the center, very senior urologists who will perform these trials, and we are very far ahead, both with the production and all of the other things that we have to do before we start. I cannot give you a date, but of course our hope is that by doing all this preparatory work, once we hopefully see an effect in those patients, then there will be a more rapid process of finding out other indications for Hamlet. I mean, we have looked at brain tumors, colon cancer in animal models as well, and there are many other things that could be done, hopefully in collaboration with others. That was a long answer to your question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Unfortunately, in Italy, we have no national monitoring of breastfeeding. So we do not know exactly what is the breastfeeding rate. And this depends mainly because we have a national health system. Okay, we have one, but it is organized on a regional basis. So there are some, let's say, good regions that invest in monitoring, and we have some data. But this data mostly came from the north of the country, and roughly we can say that at hospital discharge, 75% of babies are exclusive breastfeeding. But these data are from the northern part of the country. At 3 months of age, roughly 45% are still exclusively breastfeeding. And we have other data from the National Institute of Statistics, ISTAT, and they've periodically makes telephone interviews to collect data. The methodology is not so precise, because actually the interviewer asked mother when he breastfed and how long, and they call mothers that give birth in the 5 previous years. So you have a huge potential recall bias. So there is some doubt on the reliability of this data. Any case, from these periodical interviews, we know surveys, let's say, We know that in the northern part, babies are breastfed more and longer, okay? And in the last year, I moved for work purpose to the southern part of Italy, and I touch, in my experience, this real different situation in the south. And it depends mostly because the local health authorities do not invest in breastfeeding promotion at the organizative hospital basis, and the support is in the community is weaker or absent at all.
Buongiorno, faccio in italiano.
Good morning.
Volevo fare prima una considerazione.
My first consideration is the following. Dr. Spatz spoke about the training of nurses to help breastfeeding mothers after delivery. In my experience, it would be right to have pre-delivery courses before delivery, because of course I took a course that I paid for with an obstetrician who also delivers at home, a very well-trained person, and this course was much more interesting than the ones we can get free of charge, let's say, through the National Health Service, because of course they tell you what to put in the bag to take to the hospital, but not so much for breastfeeding. So breastfeeding, I think, should be, it's a natural act, but it's very technical, especially for new mother. So it's very technical, and you have to learn and to be well informed. I even bought a book which taught me how all this works, how to react in case of problems. All this is very important, and I reached my delivery very well informed, and I really believed in, I was very confident, and that really means a lot when you get a lot of other advice from your mother, from other people, etc. So to be able to act well, react well, you have to invest much more in these pre-delivery courses and have them on breastfeeding. And then, of course, to have well-trained nurses in the hospital are extremely important, of course. And this, of course, was my own consideration. I wanted to know if, in your opinion, this is a question I've asked myself, because I have friends who've had problems with breastfeeding. After having had an epidural injection, is there a connection with this epidural injection? Is there a connection with breastfeeding? Sometimes one has less confidence in oneself to be able to face breastfeeding. That's my own idea. I don't know if it's true, because I've seen friends who said, oh yes, breastfeeding, I'm not able to do it because it hurts. If you've delivered without an epidural injection, breastfeeding is fine, just fine. So I wanted to know if there is a sort of psychological connection there. And then another question from another colleague of mine who was rather timid, who said, well, in case of surrogate motherhood, I don't know how it works in your countries, is there a period of time of breastfeeding for this mother before giving the child away? That's another question. Surrogate motherhood.
So I'll start. At the University of Pennsylvania, where I am a professor, we have an entire semester course on human milk and breastfeeding for nurses at the undergraduate level. So this is at the baccalaureate level. So nurses receive 28 hours of lecture content or didactic content, as well as 14 hours of clinical experience. And so it doesn't exist worldwide, though. And oftentimes, what exists in programs might be a half hour, 30 minutes, an hour, but maybe not even focused on the right topics. And so that brings me to your second point of the antenatal education. In my 10-step model for human milk and breastfeeding for vulnerable infants, the very first step is informed decision. How do we ensure that the mother and her family really have an informed choice and understand the science of human milk? They understand not only why breastfeeding is important, but how to be able to initiate and then continue breastfeeding. And that if they do have an early challenge, what are the ways in which we can get help and assistance? And absolutely, the research shows that the higher a mother's self-confidence or her self-efficacy, the belief she has that she can breastfeed, the more likely she will to do that. But if we look globally, what happens in that local community is going to influence whether or not she first even makes the decision to start. The difference in Italy between the North and the South, right? That it's that different in just one country. I was just in the Dominican Republic for work. It's one of the poorest countries in the entire world, yet their exclusive breastfeeding rate is 4%. And it's all because of myths and wives' tales. Mothers in the Dominican don't want to breastfeed because they think their breasts will sag, you know? And so it's amazing how much bad information is out there. And if you were very smart, you went out, you educated yourself, you empowered yourself, you got the knowledge and the skills to be able to do this and to be able to breastfeed, but not all women do that. And so we have to change our ways in which we educate and teach about breastfeeding. We have to really change the entire message and support that we give. And then to your question related to how women give birth and whether or not they've had medication or not. So, you know, in the United States, over 90% of women have medication, epidurals. I mean, people don't want to have pain. They're like, no, pain-free, give me that epidural as soon as I can. There's actually been some research done, though, that shows that even if a mom has had an epidural anesthesia, if she has breastfeeding support, it doesn't negatively impact breastfeeding outcomes. But if she's not getting the breastfeeding help and support in the birth hospital, then she might not have a good breastfeeding experience. And at our hospital, where we have all critically ill children, many of our women have to have cesareans because of the type of the defect of the baby. They might have their abdominal wall, things might be outside, so we have to do a cesarean. But we have our cesarean moms expressing milk in the OR, and they're pumping early and often, and our cesarean moms are making more milk than our vaginal birth moms. So even if a mom had a medication or she had to have a cesarean delivery, if we focused on the first hour and the first 4 days and the first week, we could eliminate a lot of these breastfeeding challenges or these stories where moms were not able to meet their goals.
Yes, I can tell you my experience, and I can confirm exactly what Diane has told, that there are several papers demonstrating that local anesthesia during cesarean section has not affected on the breastfeeding rate, but you must, the staff of the hospital must take care of the mothers and attach the baby at the breast immediately after birth. So this is the main aspect that you should observe if you want to be successful. So it's not the effect of the drug, of the technical that you are using for the birth. But it's important, the intervention of the staff. And I saw that in many hospitals in Italy where I work as a neonatologist, the staff is used to attach the baby immediately after the cut of the abdomen. They take out the baby and they attach the baby at the breast while the mother is still in the operating theater.
Interesting.
The question regarding surrogate, so the surrogate question that you had for the surrogate mothers. So we actually have lots of these situations in my hospital. And so we always will work with the family to establish a plan. So for example, I recently had a mother who she did not have a uterus, so her sister was her surrogate. And so the biological mother, we worked with her to induce lactation. While she was still pregnant, she began on a regimen with medications and pumping. Her sister, who was her surrogate, established pumping for her while the mother was establishing supply. And so the baby received milk from the surrogate mother, as well as the biological mother. And we also have, in America, we may have same-sex couples, so we'll work with them in terms of the provision of donor milk if it's 2 men, or if it's 2 women, we'll have the biological mother who may be providing the full milk supply, but the other mother may be doing some pumping and some non-nutritive sucking. So we have all different type of families that we work with, but I certainly think prenatally, having the discussion with the family about what their goals are and helping them how to understand that no matter how you define your family or how the baby comes in to the world, there's a lot of opportunities for the provision of human milk and breastfeeding.
Thank you.
You have raised the problem of the quality of antenatal classes, and obviously they are quite different in different parts. And obviously, you can have 2 very different kind of antenatal classes that you refer as they give no information, no good information, or not enough information. And that's mainly depend on the lack of training of the health personnels. I must admit that in Italy, till now, there is no widespread breastfeeding module in the health professional curricula, okay? And I can say that's even shorter than in the past. So health professional must make a course in service, not during the curricula. So this is a really great constraint. And there are also another kind of antenatal classes that are what I call utopic antenatal classes, that they show you an ideal hospital where all is perfect and where the promotion of breastfeeding is very high standard. And yes, this is only cause of conflict or difficult to adaptation to a different condition at childbirth. So what I feel it's better is to give the right information on physiology and behavior and physiological changes in newborn, for example, and in lactation, of course, during the first days, to give the information to adapt to a new situation. Okay, you know the utopia, but there is the real world, and how you adapt. You should be empowered. So the antenatal class of good level, as far as I can appreciate, is that give the information and the competence to adapt using some useful information.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
Another question in Italian.
Okay.
Good morning, I'm Daniela Zappoli from blog Once Upon a Time There Was a Mother. Before asking the question, I have a question from my readers. In Italy, certainly, I say this as a mother of 2 children, there is a complex cultural situation for those who become mothers and who start breastfeeding. For example, Many of us are daughters of formula milk. So our mothers, because they've worked a lot, they've lost the culture of breastfeeding, and they didn't really transmit this idea to us children. I had the fortune of breastfeeding for 16 months. So at the first problem, they propose, our mothers propose formula. You grew up on this, no problem. Now, the question I have is, Dr. Davanzo spoke about the fact that breastfeeding has gone down. 75% of children come out of hospital breastfeeding after 3 months. It's 40%. Now, the problem is mothers going back to work. And so many readers ask me, how is it possible to continue to have support, to create a sort of milk chain that connects obstetricians, pediatricians, that can give the right support to mothers and indications, even technical indications to mothers, because many wanted to know in what moment of the day I can pump my milk so that I can leave my milk for the child who is maybe 2.5 months old. How is it possible to continue breastfeeding this important work which has started with the work of with the birth of the child?
That's a great point, and this is something that we think and talk about a lot in the United States. Right, currently the Affordable Care Act, as long as that lasts, protects women's space and time to pump at work and space to safely store the milk to take home for the baby. Right, so that's federal law in the United States currently. And so what it is you need to have infrastructure that has employers facilitate the breastfeeding and breast milk pumping, and discussions within family and support networks. And I've talked to a lot of moms who want to breastfeed, but it creates conflict with their own mother, because it's that their commitment to breastfeeding is perceived as a repudiation of their mother's mothering, right? And that's tough. And so there, I think, is a lot of discussion around the historical context. In the 50s and the 70s, you saw big moves away from breastfeeding in the 50s as a function of perceptions of food safety, which turned out to be untethered to scientific reality. And then you had women appreciably entering the workforce away from the home. And so I find that there's lots of discussions around, every mom I know is doing the best she can based on the information she has. And so commitments to breastfeeding now can be dialogues with mothers about celebration of what we now know about the world. And isn't it so great that we now know how to facilitate this, why it's important, why it's best practices, and have it be around broader discussions of scientific discovery and culture change, rather than about the interpersonal of how our mothers may have mothered.
There is one last question from the net. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I must remind that the Italian law is quite good in giving a long maternity leave. So you are absolutely true, but it depends if the mother is an employee or not. Your opinion, that problem could be in other countries rather than our country, where we have quite a long maternity leave. And the most breastfeeding stop in the first month. That is exactly the calibration phase of lactation. And return or to work is much is after that time. So we must consider that are different factors influencing stopping breastfeeding. That is more relating to not following the physiology and not having enough support than really the urgency to go back to work.
One sentence?
Thank you.
And I would just like to add that if you look in the US, our neighbor to the north, Canada, has long paid parental leave. Their breastfeeding exclusivity and duration are terrible. They're not much better than the United States. So the return to work, I think, often is like an excuse that we can't breastfeed versus really addressing the early breastfeeding period in the first month. And then also, again, it's about how we teach this to let women know that, yes, you can actually combine breastfeeding and employment. And I've actually done a lot of work and research in this area. And at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, our mothers, we've studied them. We have exclusive breastfeeding rates of 80% at 3 months. And we have continued breastfeeding rates over a year. So I think we have to, again, have a different dialogue about how we speak to women about how they can actually navigate these systems. Because even in the US, where we have the ACA currently, it's not the ideal law.
I want to thank you all for your questions. We have run out of time. We've already gone over, but the speakers are available after this for questions as well. And of course, you're here, you can attend the conference, you can find out in depth what each of these speakers has to say. So I want to thank you for a very lively discussion amongst yourselves and with our audience, and wish you all much enjoyment of the symposium to come. Thank you. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for coming. Yeah, thank you. You're not
Quello della maternità surrogata non l'ho capito tanto, se devo essere sincero. Non ho capito che cosa volesse sapere.
Io glielo chiedo. Sì, prego. Grazie.
È stato un piacere.